Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Dr. Karen Clausen-Brown on making church records accessible, reflections from an archives internship. I'm so glad that you've been able to join us today. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue today and into the future. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the Congregational Library's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive, which has more than 100,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students and scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. A key aspect of our work at the Congregational Library is the preservation of church records. Congregational church records provide a window into the history of a community and its many families. Memories of events, outreach programs, community engagement, and much more may appear specific to a church and its mission, but when combined with memories from other congregations, these materials tell a larger story. And it's not just about the community, but that in itself is important. But it's a story about American society and Congregationalism's place within it. We are so grateful here at the Congregational Library that the Hillsborough Centre Congregational Society in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, entrusted their records to us. And you're going to learn more about them in today's talk. We are equally grateful to Simmons University for partnering with us on today's event. So now let me turn the program over to Zachary Bodnar, archivist here at the Congregational Library, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm Zachary Bodnar, one of the archivists here at the Congregational Library and Archives. A couple of months ago, I, along with CLA's other archivist, Billy McCarthy, spoke about concrete steps that churches can take to manage and preserve their own records. But the stewardship of church records and the mission and memory found therein is a broad theme. And today's talk speaks to the role of archivists in that story. When a collection arrives at the CLA, it becomes the role of the archivist to appraise, process, describe, and preserve those records. We do this not so that these important records can sit on a shelf and gather dust, but so that the memories found within those records can find new life in front of the researchers, genealogists, students, and all who come and visit our library. Accessibility is one of the most important aspects of our work here at the CLA, and I think today's talk will be illuminating for how we, as archivists, work towards making these collections accessible for all. The Congregational Library and Archives is also incredibly honored and happy that year in and year out, we had the opportunity to work with Simmons University graduates. The class, LIS 438, Introduction to Archival Theory and Practice, includes a 60-hour internship component, and the CLA has been host to more than a few 438 interns over the years. As a graduate of Simmons University myself, I can attest to how important it is to be able to put to practice real-world practices and the methodologies and best practices learned in the classroom. In some ways, the archival field, is a field that is best learned through practical experiences. And the internship program at Simmons does an excellent job of providing students an opportunity to gain that firsthand experience and to see the ways in which archival theory is applied to real-world collections and all of their many, many, many eccentricities. I must say, too, that the internship program is a two-way street. I, as a supervisor, learn a lot from our interns. For example, how to be a better manager, mentor, and educator. The role of the archivist isn't simply to sit in the basement and process collections. Ours is a role to ensure that the collections we steward come alive through accessibility, reference work, public programming, and all inclusive education. We archivists wear a lot of hats, and we learn best when in dialogue with other gallery, library, archives, and museum professionals and paraprofessionals, no matter where they might be in their careers. Now, please let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Karen Clausen-Brown is a student at Simmons University pursuing an MLIS degree with a concentration in archives management. Prior to pursuing her degree at Simmons, she earned her BA in English, Religion, and Biblical Languages from Walla Walla University and her MA and PhD in Early Modern English Literature from the University of Notre Dame. She served as assistant and then assistant professor of English at Walla Walla University, teaching courses on writing, medieval and early modern English literature, and religion and literature. Her research focuses on the writings of John Milton, and she has published in Milton Studies, the 17th Century and Religion and Literature. Once she completes her degree at Simmons, she hopes to work as a librarian or archivist specializing in rare books, manuscripts, and special collections. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you at the CLA for being here and for mentoring me. Everyone has been so welcoming and helpful, and I've learned so much in this internship. I also want to especially thank Zachary Bodnar, who has been my supervisor, as he said, and who has taken time out of his busy schedule to mentor me. I'm really thankful for his persistent willingness to explain things and answer my questions and just generally be kind of my introduction to the archival profession. I've really come to admire both his humor and the seriousness with which he takes the archival profession. So thank you so much. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about the project that I worked on during my internship and reflect on what I learned. The records I worked on included administrative and financial records. Let me back up. My project for the internship was to work on a small collection of church records. The particular collection I worked on was a set of records from the Hillsborough Centre Congregational Society in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And this congregation first began meeting in 1769, though the records that are represented in the collection at the CLA span from 1840 to 2022. And you can see a photo of the church's building here that was taken in 1962. The records that I worked on included administrative and financial records, building and cemetery records, preaching records, records of Sunday services, and a fair amount of correspondence. The collection also includes some membership records and records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Essentially, my project for this internship was to create for the collection the two things that you can see here: a neatly ordered box of archival records, and also what is called a finding aid, which is basically a standardized document in the archival profession that describes the contents of the collection and helps researchers or students or whoever might want to access the collection to actually locate what they need within the collection. If you've ever done any research in an archives or a special collections library, these two things, the box of records and the finding aid, might look familiar to you. Prior to this internship, I'd conducted some research in various libraries and archives, and as a researcher, these were what I thought of when I thought of an archive. My experience was fairly standard. If I needed to conduct research in a particular archives or repository, I'd use the catalog and the finding aids to locate the materials I needed. I'd ask the librarian in the reading room to retrieve those materials from wherever they might be in storage. And then I would get a box delivered to me, something like the one you see here, and I'd begin doing my research. As I said, my experience was pretty standard, and it's what most researchers are used to encountering when they go to an archives. The finding aid and neatly ordered boxes of records don't just magically appear, though. They must be carefully prepared by archivists. And in this internship, I got the opportunity to go behind the scenes and experience how it is that archival collections take these forms and become accessible to researchers. Archivists use the word processing to describe the work of creating these tools and making records accessible to researchers. And my job this semester was to do that work of processing. When the Hillsborough Centre Congregational Society records actually arrived at the CLA, this is what they looked like. What you can't quite see here is that the records actually came to us in a reused toaster box, a box that used to hold a toaster. While I'm all for reusing and recycling boxes, and this box was a totally fine container for shipping the donation to the library, it isn't really what researchers are going to expect if they come to the CLA to do research. You can also see that the records are arranged in some file folders and that there are some labels that somewhat organize the collection. Still, though, it isn't as orderly as one might like, and these folders aren't really what a researcher is going to be looking for if they come to an archives to do research. So how does the collection go from this toaster box here to the neatly arranged archival box and finding aid that researchers are used to seeing? Well, the first step was to do what archivists call accessioning the collection. Accessioning is the work that archivists do when a donation first arrives in their repository. And it involves both making a record of the collection's arrival and doing kind of an initial broad assessment of the contents of the collection and the state of the donation. As it turns out, the materials in this collection were actually in pretty good shape, so there wasn't a need for a whole lot of initial preservation. Accessioning, this step of accessioning was still pretty informative and fun, though, for me as an intern, because it gave Zachary a chance to teach me about some of the problems that I could potentially encounter with donated materials. The CLA has a list of potential conservation challenges that they check for in all of their donations. And as Zachary and I reviewed that list, he showed me examples to illustrate each of the potential challenges that I might encounter. He pulled files from the CLA's archives, old books from the stacks, and even a film reel from the rare book room. And this was just a really terrific chance for me to get a tour of the CLA and also to see potential conservation challenges firsthand. The examples that Zachary showed me are a perfect example of why doing a hands-on internship like this one is so much more valuable than just learning about something kind of theoretically in a textbook. The next step in archival processing was to arrange the collection. Arranging just means ordering, putting the records into an order that makes them easily findable and accessible to researchers. When arranging a collection, the first thing archivists look for is what is known as original order. That is, they look to see if the creator of the records have already arranged the materials into some kind of meaningful order. And then when it makes sense, they try to preserve that original order because it can give helpful context and meaning to the records. I'd learned about the theoretical principle of original order in my classes at Simmons. But one letter I encountered in processing the Hillsborough collection really illustrated to me firsthand how important and valuable preserving original order can be. So the document that you see here on the slide is a letter, seemingly written probably by a child or a young person named Jonathan, and writing to a Mrs. Baldwin, who I believe was the church clerk at the time. Jonathan writes, "I will be happy to ring the bell this year at church." Out of context, this letter is already pretty endearing, but it takes on even more meaning and becomes even more endearing in light of where this letter appears in the collection, that is, within its original order. This letter was originally interfiled with a set of correspondence between the Hillsborough Centre Congregational Society and a number of ministers throughout the northeastern United States. Since the early 20th century, the Society has convened for Sunday services only during the summer, and they've not had their own minister. And that has meant that they've needed to rely on drawing ministers from all around the Northeast to come and preach from them on particular Sundays. And many of these ministers are quite prominent, well-educated ministers, and this collection contains a pretty substantial collection of replies and correspondence between these ministers and the church, in which they discuss, which Sundays they can come to visit or might be able to preach. So as I said, this letter from Jonathan agreeing to ring the church bell was interfiled with all of those letters from these prominent ministers. And within that context, it becomes clear that the church was treating the invitation to Jonathan to ring the church bell, sort of like they were treating the invitations to these other ministers. And they were valuing his contributions to the church, however small, in a similar way to how they were viewing the minister's contributions. And I have to confess that I smiled when I came across this letter amongst the other letters. And as I was processing the collection, I definitely preserved the collection's original order and left this letter in with the other letters so that future researchers can find it and smile too, hopefully. Another step in arranging the collection, besides determining meaningful original order, was to look for similar kinds of records that could be meaningfully grouped together. For instance, the 4 documents that you see here are standardized reports in which the church collected information for the congregational yearbook. Originally, these documents were kind of dispersed throughout the collection, but it was pretty easy for me to see that grouping these similar records together would make the collection more orderly and accessible. So those were fairly easy to identify as similar. Sometimes, though, identifying similarities between records was more challenging. When I had nearly finished grouping the collection's items into similar forms, I found that I had some remaining leftovers that didn't seem to fit in any discernible category. So for instance, among my stack of leftovers, I found the 3 documents that you can see here. In the top left corner is a newspaper clipping about a bicentennial celebration for the church. The top right corner is a program from a musical concert at the church, and at the bottom is a program from a memorial service that the church had held. And particularly when these 3 records were mixed in with all the other records, leftover records from the collection, it was kind of hard to see that they had anything in common. They seemed pretty different to me. Luckily, Zachary, who of course has more experience than I do, was able to see similarities between these records that I couldn't see. And he pointed out, well, actually, those are all about church events. I was like, oh yeah. So ultimately, I was able to pull all of these together and into a folder that I called events. Perhaps the most exciting and illuminating part of arranging the collection for me was putting its contents into chronological order. You can see here a set of cards that are ordered by date in their upper right-hand corner. And this was actually one of the easier set of records to order chronologically, and arranging them in chronological order was pretty intuitive. Some of the records were a little less intuitive though, and the process of putting them into chronological order proved really illuminating. And I should say that because of my educational background, which is in literary studies and not history, I think it was easier for me to anticipate the usefulness of grouping records by form or by genre, because that's kind of what literary scholars do. It was harder for me to anticipate how useful it was going to be to put things into chronological or historical order. But what I found was that as I put the records in chronological order, patterns began to emerge. Sets of correspondence that I had been confused by, it suddenly became clear when they were put into order. I started to see how particular names or events were important at particular moments in the church's history. And I also started to see or be able to identify different distinct eras in the church's history. And that was pretty exciting. And it was exciting to anticipate too how putting the records into chronological order might help researchers in the future also see patterns in the records. Another important step in processing the collection was taking steps to make sure that it would be carefully preserved so that researchers far into the future could benefit from its information. I kept an eye on preservation concerns actually throughout the time I was processing the collection. But some of the most significant preservation tasks that I did occurred after I'd finished arranging the collection, so I'm going to talk about them here. One step in preserving the collection was removing staples and paper clips, or what archivists sometimes call fasteners. And the reason that we remove these is that they can sometimes cause rust damage in the collection. So in the image on the left here, you can see some documents from which I removed paper clips, and you can see that the paper clips are already leaving a bit of rust damage. At this point, the damage isn't, it's fairly minimal, but it's still important to remove the fasteners now so that future damage doesn't occur. In the image on the right, you can see where a staple was in a pamphlet and it's been removed. And if you look carefully, you can also see that the staple was beginning to cause some rust damage as well. The metal tool that you see in that image is called a spatula, and I learned how to use that. It's a special tool that allows you to remove staples in such a way that you don't damage the documents that they're in. Preserving the collection also means protecting fragile documents. As I already mentioned, this collection was actually in pretty good condition, but one document that did need some special attention was this letter, which was written on onion skin paper. The bottom right-hand corner of the letter had ripped off, as you can see, and we wanted to make sure that that corner and the words on it remained with the rest of the letter. So Zachary helped me put the two pieces of the letter into a Mylar sleeve, which is essentially a protective plastic coating. And the Mylar keeps the pieces of the letter together, and it also prevents further damage to the fragile paper. Handling newspaper clippings was another important step in preserving the collection. Archival donations frequently come with clippings as part of the donation, but they're actually kind of a difficult material for archivists to preserve. Newspapers are printed on very fragile acidic paper that degrades quickly. It can also potentially damage the other materials in the collection. And also, newspaper clippings technically aren't unique or rare materials since they're printed, and so they can usually be accessed by researchers elsewhere if they need to access those articles. So for that reason, sometimes archivists will actually discard newspaper clippings altogether. And different archives deal with newspaper clippings in different ways. But one common approach, which is the approach that I took with this collection, is to photocopy the news clippings on acid-free paper, discard the original clippings, and then file the photocopies in with the rest of the collection. So that way, future researchers will be able to read the news articles and see them in the context of the collection, but we don't have to worry about the original clippings falling apart or causing damage to the rest of the collection. And this image is just the sheets of photocopied newspaper clippings that I prepared. Finally, preserving the collection means refoldering and reboxing the materials in acid-free, size-appropriate containers that will preserve their contents. And boxes and folders also make the contents of the collection easier to find because they can be easily labeled. And you can see that the collection is neatly arranged in its new folders and boxes here, and it's already starting to look more like the standard archival collection that I'm used to. My work wasn't done though, because I still needed to do what archivists call describing the collection. The work of describing in archival processing is basically the work of creating the finding aid. It means explaining to researchers in a kind of standardized form what is in the collection, how it's been arranged, and how it can be accessed. So in the case of this collection, describing it meant doing a bit of historical research about the church's history that I could write up in the finding aid. And for this step, I pulled some other relevant documents about Hillsborough, New Hampshire from the CLA's collection, which you can see stacked up here. And these resources help me to describe the Hillsborough Center's history. In describing the collection, it's also important where possible to help researchers see connections between the collection that they're currently looking at and other related materials in the repository's collection. And this turned out to be actually a pretty interesting step in the case of this collection. As Zachary and I were looking into the CLA's holdings for historical information about the Hillsborough Centre, we found some early manuscript records that the CLA already possessed from the Hillsborough Centre. And they're the two handwritten documents that you see here on the left and the bottom. And they nicely complement the two newly donated documents, which are at the top here and on the right. All four of these documents are sort of similar kinds of documents. They're all confessions and covenant documents, and all four were used at various times by the Hillsborough Centre. Ultimately, we ended up adding the two manuscript documents to the Hillsborough collection while keeping a note of where they originally came from. And that way, when future researchers are looking for information about the Hillsborough Centre at the CLA, they'll be able to find all of the relevant records that they might be interested in one place. So finally, when I'd finished accessioning, arranging, preserving, and describing the collection, I had produced the finding aid and set of document boxes, or the document box that you see here. So now, when researchers go to the CLA, they'll be able to do what they expect to do as researchers. They'll be able to find the materials that they need in the finding aid. They'll be able to ask a librarian to retrieve those materials for them, and they'll be able to look through a well-ordered box of records for the information that they need. Among other things, This internship taught me to appreciate the behind the scenes work and expertise that goes into making records like these accessible. And I hope my presentation has given you a better appreciation of that process too. Thanks so much for your attention.
That was great, Karen. Thank you so much. Let me bring Zachary back. And I also want to introduce, let's see, wait for this to come back up. We are going to be joined by Reverend Dr. Charles Hambrick-Stowe, who is a longtime friend of the Congregational Library and Archives. I think many of you out there will recognize Charlie as the chairman of the board of directors for many years here. He's the retired pastor of the First Congregational Church in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And he's written more books than I have. He's written many books. I'm not going to give you all the titles here, but great to see you, Charlie. And you were really helped facilitate bringing the Hillsborough Centre Congregational Society records here. I wonder, maybe you talk a little bit about the process, that they didn't, how did they get into the toaster box and how did they make their way to Boston?
Yeah, well, I plead guilty to the toaster box. Actually, the women that were really responsible for this at the Hillsborough Centre Church had, one of them had purchased a fireproof box in which, when she started gathering these things, and because some of the more recent things we've retained in Hillsborough, we kept those in the fireproof box. And for ease of transport to 14 Beacon Street, I was looking for something convenient, and there was a toaster box. Perfect. Able to carry it on the Green Line without any suspicion.
I think there's one part of the story that I've really loved is the way it became reunited with materials that were already here. And I don't know, Charlie, did you know there was Hillsborough stuff here? Elizabeth, did you know?
No, I didn't. I wish I had. A few years ago, we helped with the 250th anniversary in 19. Unfortunately, that was just pre-pandemic. So we had a very big and successful event. If it happened a year later, it would have all just not happened. So I preached the anniversary sermon and dug into materials, including the books that you referenced, Karen, at the Hillsborough local library rather than Congregational Library. So no, I probably should have done that. That would have been even better. But yeah, that was the connection with the wider movements that are happening. It's such a fascinating story. This little church, it's a very small summer chapel since the 1930s, since 1935, and had been closed, as you noted, for about a decade before that. And it is tied in really with the history of these towns in New England, because there had been an attempt to begin a congregation before in the 1750s, but then with French and Indian Wars, that all came to naught, and then was re-established. But it was a farming community, and it was, of course, by then the early 1800s that industrialization, and down on the Kentucky River, what was then called Bridge Village, because of the bridge across the Kentucky, now called Smith Memorial Congregational Church, was founded by the pastor of the Seth Farnsworth was the pastor at the time in 1839, who just basically saw the writing on the wall that the transition from farming community to the mills, and was the population shifted down into town, what is now Hillsborough, and so Smith Memorial Church continues to look upon Hillsborough Centre as the mother church, even though it's just a very small congregation. And the wisest thing that was done later after that fire in the late 19th century was they rebuilt, because it had been quite a substantial meeting house before that. Sat hundreds of people in Hillsborough Centre, and they built this really more modest kind of chapel, which was appropriate. So it's an interesting story of change over time.
Mhm.
This is, one of the questions that's sort of coming to my mind as I think about this story, and this is one for you, Karen, and Zachary, if you want to kind of jump in. When you're designing a kind of system for these records, is there a template for congregational churches, or is it really just what the record? I mean, I feel like you're kind of like a record whisperer, it's what the records tell you should be their order, especially as it seems likely maybe new materials will come to light. We found materials here, if future materials from this congregation, maybe, somebody who is a parishioner has a scrapbook or has materials. Can the collection grow with new materials? Is it designed in that sort of way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Zach can talk about this in more detail than I can, but there are definitely ways in which you can accrue onto a collection and add additional materials. You document where it came from, and maybe it came from a separate place. But that's part of the exciting thing about a repository like this, is that you have records with all these other records, and they take on additional meaning. So yeah, there's definitely a process for that. Zach can probably add to that more detail than I can.
Yeah. Every collection is going to be unique. So there's not any, and that's true across all types of archival collections. There's no prescription that will solve all issues when doing arrangement of a collection. That said, a lot of our practices are based around things that Karen already talked about: original order. When we can identify original order and maintain it, that's always going to be one of the key principles of our work. And if we get a new accrual of additional materials, as Karen said again, we document it so that it doesn't interfere with any other original order that's found in the collection. It's a lot of what we do is basically paperwork and documentation, ultimately. But also outside of original order, we use both thematic and linear methods of organization that are easy to slot into. It's creating that folder of church events and putting the date range on that folder. If we get something in the future, it's as long as we document that those materials came in the future and how they came in. If there's materials from that new accrual that say are also about church events, a program for the 300th anniversary, for example, it could easily just slot into that folder.
A question that's come in, and this is I'm going to ask this to Zachary and Charlie and Elizabeth. What are the biggest impediments to a community or a congregation giving its records to the Congregational Library and Archive? Are there things that keep people from thinking, that keep them from wanting to give their records or knowing they can give their records?
I had a similar kind of experience when I was pastor in Ridgefield, Connecticut, where we celebrated the 300th anniversary while I was there. This was in 2012. And we really had a several year run up to this. And a member of the church, and I produced a small book of the history of the church. And there was an archival closet, which supposedly was temperature controlled and all of this. And I went through.
Karen is smiling.
And I did find, in Connecticut, the church records are at the back in the 1930s, or at the State House. So we have microfilm versions of the older records. But there was one important document, primary document, that was the Clinton Clark diary from the 1850s. And it seemed it was in pretty good shape, and I was able to use that and so on. And I presented to the church the idea of having this reside at the Congregational Library. And there was no resistance to that because, I mean, first of all, nobody even knew it was there. And so now it's available and accessible. But number two, and most significantly, once it arrived at the Congregational Library, and I think Sarah can talk about this, the first thing they discovered was it had active mold. And so that had to be remediated before anything else could be done with it. Zachary, I don't know if were you there in 12 or not yet?
I don't think I was here yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've used that as an example for why churches, they thought they were taking such good care of it in this special archival closet that had air conditioning, but there was active mold on this, the most significant thing that was in that closet.
Yeah, that's and not something we like here at all. Zachary and Karen, when you work with congregations, when people reach out, or when you imagine the types of conversations you have, are there things that you try to assuage fears about, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Fears of not having enough manpower or not having enough time often. Sometimes when we're contacted, it's a church that's in the process of closing and they have a firm date on when the building is going to be sold and when records need to arrive here. And that can cause anxiety. And a lot of my work is to try to assuage as much of that anxiety as possible. Every donation, every time we work with a church and about their records, it's all going to be different. Every situation is different, but one of the things I constantly try to say is that our work here is for you. It is what we do is to help you. It is, and more importantly, it is to help you to preserve the records and the memories and the mission that is found within those records, whether that is through questions about one's stewardship of one's own records, or if that's about the donation of materials to us or another appropriate institution. So yeah, a lot of what we do to try and create connections and to ensure that everyone's on the same page, and that everyone is feeling good about the decisions that are being made and as informed about those decisions that are being made as possible.
So nice question here for Karen. So you're at the end of the semester. Congratulations. I don't know, Zachary, if you get to assign the grade for this semester, but from where I'm sitting, it looked like a straight A. Now that you've completed this project, can you reflect a little on what was the most enjoyable or interesting part of this for you? What would be the part you'd love to go back and do again?
Yeah. The process of putting things into chronological order. I mean, it seems like it would be boring, but it was so illuminating. Just looking through the stuff initially, there were just lots of things I hadn't quite sorted out what it had to do with anything. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And that was really exciting. And I look forward to doing that in the future. I don't think it needs to be done with this collection again, but in the future, that felt like a kind of an aha moment. So that was pretty cool. I did really like that letter from the little boy. When I got to that, I said, Zach, this letter is so cool. Look, it just looked like a kid's handwriting. So yeah,
now you can go to the MFA and see some of his work.
Yes, that's so exciting. And I have to say too, it's very exciting to meet the donor and to hear these stories. I mean, things about the collection that obviously I don't know, that we don't know, and that's such a treat. So I'm so delighted to be able to meet you as well.
Well, and this might be an encouragement to other churches as well. When we were looking at this, I thought, this is really pretty insignificant stuff. I mean, really. I mean, it's ephemeral. It's it's a very small, insignificant kind of corner of New England. So why bother? And to hear the excitement that you've exuded, Karen, in working with it, it's like, oh, okay, this does have significance, and bringing order out of it and seeing the connections with other places that have had similar, there's really significance there. And that ought to be an encouragement to local people that their material matters. It really does.
Well, I think that's, you bring up is a question, it's reminded me of a question that Zachary and Billy got in the workshop they did in October, which was basically to the effect, we've had some embarrassing things that have happened in our history. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Should we just leave them out? Should we not include them in the materials that we give to the library? And Karen, with your experience now seeing this collection, Zachary, with your long experience, what is the answer? Should one leave out the not so nice, squabbles that happened in the past?
Yes, those are all need to be a part of the story. A collection is the sum of its parts, and a story is only whole when the whole is there to tell. And there's been many times in history, go back to the founding of the United States, we're missing portions of the records related to the Second Continental Congress because someone thought that it would be too embarrassing and threw them into a fireplace, is how the story goes. And now we look back on with sadness over that. We don't know the full story necessarily, and every story is like that. There's no sanitized version of that. That is, yeah. We and our role here is to preserve that whole memory. So yeah, no, always don't try to look at the past and say, oh, this is embarrassing or this could lead to hurt feelings. We need to engage with the past. And there's a lot of portions of work being done in the public history realm right now that's related to reclaiming history and learning how to look at the past and be able to confront it and say that we're going to learn and be better from it. So
I've gotten here a report, a comment from Sarah Martin confirming that you're doing well in the class, Karen. So I want to reiterate how much we appreciate the connection with Simmons University, such a world-class library program. And so I was in Philadelphia, as some of you know, for many years at the American Philosophical Society, and most of the staff there had gone to Temple, which also has a great program. I come up here and everybody's gone to Simmons. So I want to keep that tradition going. Maybe sort of as a final question, Karen, you're a Milton scholar, you're a recovering faculty member, now you're an archivist. Continuity or change?
Yes, both. There's definitely continuity, and especially at this repository. I was so excited when Sarah told me, she's the teacher, by the way, for the class I'm taking. When she said I had been assigned here, this is really where I wanted to come. When I arrived on the first day, I should say I worked on John Milton, but I worked on his relationship to, or his responses to debates about Sabbath keeping in the 17th century. And when I arrived on the first day and I saw the outside of the Congregational Library, there's these 4, what are they called, reliefs, I guess. In one of them, I was looking at the plaque and it said, oh, it's the first Sunday or the first Sabbath in, I'm now forgetting the details, but I was like, oh my word, I'm in the right place. This is so cool. I mean, this is very much a new way of thinking about things, which has been exciting. And I feel like I'm learning to appreciate the processes and things that have made my previous research possible. And that's that's really exciting. It's also just fun to get to spend time in libraries. That was always my favorite part of things before anyway. So that's been cool.
Karen, thank you so much. Zachary, thank you so much. Charles and Elizabeth, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have had this great conversation. I hope everyone out there listening will come and join us at the Congregational Library and look at these records now that they're available.